We are really delighted to welcome you this evening to Concordia to celebrate the culmination of a year's celebration of Eastchester's 350th anniversary. And we end, as we began, with a book. We opened the year, as you may or may not recall, with the author James Zuckerman to hear about 97 Orchard Street. And tonight, we gather to celebrate with another book, Out of the Wilderness, a remarkable first ever history of Eastchester and its two villages, Tuckahoe and Bronxville. The many contributing authors of this book have made a significant contribution to documenting the history of this area, and I'm certain it took a great deal of time, effort, thought to produce this. It's truly a work of scholarship. When you look at this thing, it really is amazing. It really is amazing. Concordia is delighted to be part of this celebration. We're grateful for our history in Bronxville, next door to Tuckahoe, and in this town of Eastchester for so long. Thank you all for joining us, and without further ado, I want to turn this over to Concordia's own Eloise Morgan.
Thank you, VG. I want to join VG in saying that we're delighted to have you all here tonight to be with us, and we're equally delighted to have a book to launch tonight. It only arrived last Friday after a long and fairly slow boat ride from Hong Kong where it was printed, so just in the nick of time. This book began about 3 years ago with a gleam in the eye of Bob Riggs, co-chair of the 350th Steering Committee, and it wraps up now with the very highly organized distribution system set up by our other co-chair, Linda Doherty Laird, who is the Eastchester Town Hall clerk. In between those 2 points in time, about 12 volunteers spent 3.5 years, or 3 years collectively, about thousands of hours each, researching and writing and editing what has turned out to be our 340-page, heavily illustrated book. And we'd like to think it combines a kind of coffee table book style with solid documented research. Richard Forliano, a longtime Eastchester town historian, and I, as Bronxville village historian, headed up the book team. And Richard, who knows more Eastchester history than all of the rest of us together, I think, came up with most of the topics that are covered in the book. 15 authors contributed to the publication, and 8 of us, as you can see, are here tonight to try to spend a few minutes talking about some of the things that we learned as we researched. Any one of us could probably take up the whole time that we've been allocated. So what we've done instead is to try to each focus on 1 or 2 topics in our area to elaborate on a little bit more. The speakers tonight are, and if you will raise your hand when I mention your name, George Pietarinen, who is a longtime educator from Eastchester, currently teaching at LIU Hudson, who wrote about the life and the early settlement in land that would become Eastchester of Anne Hutchinson. Marilynn Hill, who is the honorary co-chair for life of the Bronxville Historical Conservancy and has so many other relevant credentials that I can't mention them, wrote about the slavery, the practice of slavery in Eastchester and its regional and national context, and Marilynn was part of the editing team. Richard Forliano, I've mentioned him before. He is a retired teacher from Eastchester, and he focused on the population and demographic trends in the early 20th century in all three communities. Janet Lentz is a retired attorney from Bronxville, and she delved into the Great Depression and with particular emphasis on the New Deal programs here in our town and villages. Jeff Zuckerman and Clare Gorman, a husband-wife team, and retired Bronxville school teachers who make their home in Tuckahoe, captured the stories of some of our outstanding athletes from the earliest 20th century. And Lissa Halen, another longtime educator who lives in northern Eastchester, started out to write a short sidebar on the Hutchinson River Parkway, but it morphed into more, and it now covers the history of both of the rivers that form our borders and the two parkways. Several other authors are not on the panel tonight, but I really do want to acknowledge their contributions. Regina Bayo, retired lawyer who lives in Bronxville, examined Eastchester life in the early 17th century, and she particularly looked into the 1665 Eastchester Covenant and its place in history as one of the early examples of governance by the people. Harry Dunkak, professor emeritus at Iona College, detailed a provincial assembly election on Eastchester Green in 1733 that's become quite famous because of John Peter Zinger's newspaper report. Edna Gabler, a longtime publishing executive and Bronxville resident, wrote about Eastchester and Westchester County suffering through the Revolution in no man's land between two opposing armies, and she also was one of our major editors of the book. David Osborne, director of St. Paul's National Historic Site in Mount Vernon, covered the Civil War from the perspective of those who lived here in Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. Jim Peccioni, retired police officer from Eastchester, wrote a sidebar on the history of Eastchester's lakes and their relationship to the New Rochelle Water Company. And Joe Esposito, a professional genealogist with family ties to Eastchester going back to the 1800s, researched and made sense for the rest of us of 350 years of federal, state, and local census records. Claudia Keenan, an educational historian formerly from Bronxville and Tuckahoe, and now living in Atlanta, compared and contrasted the three school districts as they navigated the early 20th century's increasing professionalism of elementary and secondary education. So that gives you a sense of some of the content of the book. I will start by talking about the chapter that I researched and wrote, which is the first one in the book, in which I trace the physical and municipal changes in the town and the two villages over the centuries. And one of the things I got particularly interested in was how the part of Eastchester, that is today's modern Eastchester, where we're all sitting, became part of colonial Eastchester. The story begins with the early records. There's a 1664 deed from Thomas Pell to 10 Puritan families from Fairfield County, Connecticut, which was signed when this area was still part of Dutch New Netherlands. But 2 months later, the English forced the Dutch out, causing the Eastchester folks to seek a land grant from the English royal family. And in 1666, they did receive a patent or a land grant from the Duke of York. But looking at these two documents, it's a total mystery how anybody could have figured out where the land was. It's almost devoid of description and extremely vague, but we do know from other sources that that original settlement was down by Co-op City in today's Bronx. The 1666 patent did say that Eastchester had rights to land running from the Hutchinson River 8 miles into the woods to the Bronx River. But it also provided that certain land between Eastchester and the town of Westchester, a nearby community, would lie in common, used by both and maybe even owned by both. And not too surprisingly, that led to controversy and struggle for more than 50 years. And at the heart of that dispute was the land that makes up most of modern Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. It was a section called the Long Reach, maybe because it reached from somewhere down in Mount Vernon up along the Bronx River all the way to Scarsdale. And I have to say, when I think about 17th century settlers carving farms and livelihoods out of the wilderness, what I do not think of is court proceedings and petitions to the governor and hiring of lawyers. But that is what the early town records indicate that Eastchester folks spent an awful lot of time and money on. In the end, Eastchester prevailed in its struggle with Westchester, which was a larger, wealthier, and more prominent community. And we are all residents of Eastchester, not of Westchester town, as a result. But how that happened is not completely clear. I can give you some hints. Eastchester's first step in documenting its right to this land was to purchase it directly from the Indians. And the Indians had been making some claims on the land in the 1680s, and so finally in 1700, Eastchester paid the Indians with a collection of coats and guns and tools and some barrels of cider, a little reminiscent of the purchase of Manhattan. And for that, they got 7,000 acres of land in a deed that now, for the first time, describes in terms that you can almost understand. And when you compare it with a 1708 deed, a map, the first map of Eastchester, you can see that it included not just the Long Reach, but the original land grant, the whole area that became colonial Eastchester, from Scarsdale between the two rivers all the way down to 229th Street and dipping down below Co-op City. But it seems like Westchester town didn't know anything about this sale. They certainly continued to lay claim to the Long Reach. And so Eastchester's second step in 1704 was to make a deal with 3 wealthy, well-connected New York City politicians who had an in with the royal governor. And jointly, they petitioned for a grant from the English Queen of the Long Reach. The royal governor, not only was he pretty corrupt, he was the beloved cousin of Queen Anne. And within 2 months, that petition was granted, very fast for that time. And once again, it appears that Westchester town didn't know anything about it. But now Eastchester had another big problem. This 1708 patent gave an undivided half interest in all of this land to these 3 New York City politicians, and they expected to be bought out. I'm really running out of time. So, spoiler alert, they did buy them out eventually after about 20 years. But the details are found in the first chapter of the book, and I'll refer you to that. Thank you. George?
Sure. But thinking about how to consolidate a chapter into 5 minutes was tough. So I figured let's just focus on one part of Anne Hutchinson's life. And let's just focus on something that Albert Einstein, of all people, said, not about Anne Hutchinson, but in general, about great spirits being crushed by mediocre minds. And that's exactly what happened to Anne Hutchinson. Eleanor Roosevelt put Anne Hutchinson on the top of her list of great American women. Why? That's what this chapter explores. Let's look at the end of her life in Eastchester to see why that is. Her life and death illustrate the observation of the 19th century historian Lord Acton, who described religion as one of the most important motivators in history. Now, it's important for us to understand that the whole concept that we have of separation of church and state was an idea that was foreign throughout history, and especially foreign here in America. The settlements in Massachusetts were religious settlements. Church and state were one. If you were too liberal and you thought maybe it wasn't so, you went to the Isle of Errors to live with Roger Williams in Rhode Island, who even was one of the first people to mention that church should be separated from state. If you were too conservative, on the other hand, you went to Connecticut to live with the Congregationalists. Now, she settled eventually in an area, Eastchester went all the way down to the Bronx. As you probably know, she settled in the northeast Bronx. We don't know exactly where her house was, but it was probably in the area around where Co-op City is now. The Puritans had a whole different idea about religion. Religion was not a discrete and personal matter, but it permeated everything you did in life. Anne Hutchinson didn't fit in Massachusetts. That's why she was banished and excommunicated. She went to Rhode Island. She didn't really fit in there. A couple of terrible things happened to her. Her husband, that she loved very much, who she had a good relationship with, they had 15 children. He died. Then she had a miscarriage. Just to show you the meanness of the Puritans, when she had a miscarriage, the Governor Winthrop, said of her, she got what she deserved. It was God's judgment on her. She wasn't happy in Rhode Island, so she came over here to what became Eastchester. And she was looking for an area where she could live in peace and just be kind of left alone. But that wasn't about to happen. This was a hornet's nest. The Dutch, who controlled the area, were cruel and disingenuous, as were the Native Americans. There was evil on both sides. A name that you should probably know is Governor Kieft. What Governor Kieft did to her was he took money, and a corrupt Dutch official did not pass the money on to the Indians, so therefore there was no payment made for her land. And we know the Indian who killed her was named Wampage because the tradition among the Indians was to take the name of a very prominent person you had killed. And he took the name Ann Hoke to add to his name. Now, after Anne was killed, she was massacred, 6 of her children, 9 other people. According to legend, one person survived, her daughter Susanna, hid in Split Rock, but that legend is not universally accepted. Not all of her children had come with her to this area. In fact, one stayed in Boston and sired a long line of very politically active people. The governor, her great-grandson, Thomas, was the governor of Massachusetts. He happened to be a loyalist during the Revolution, and that was another problem. She had descendants on both sides of the political spectrum. FDR is her 6th great-grandson, but George H.W. Bush is her 9th great-grandson. And she has a very interesting legacy in the founding of Harvard. Harvard, as we know, was the first college in the United States, and what became the United States, and Harvard was founded specifically to train ministers of the very ilk who had combated Anne Hutchinson. And the Puritans were a little bit afraid that Anne Hutchinson was a bit too smart for them, because they wanted to make the ministers even smarter. Now, did you know that If you went to Ann Hutchinson High School, Ann Hutchinson Elementary School, you were going to a school named after a criminal because Ann Hutchinson was excommunicated and banished. It was not until 1987 that Governor Michael Dukakis officially pardoned her.
That's a good place to stop.
Yeah, it sure is. The tragedy of her whole life is that she was born to be a minister, and a very good one, but she couldn't become a minister, probably, as you'll read, because she was a woman. Marilynn?
Marilynn?
Thank you. Well, Eloise and Richard asked us just to make a few comments tonight. They said either give something that you thought was a surprise to you or would be to your readers, or just some interesting reactions that you've had. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of those. About the same time I was asked to write this chapter, Richard and Eloise shared a letter that they had received from a local Bronxville historian who had talked to and received a note from a local African-American educator in this area who said, please this time don't ignore our community. And all of the large histories that you've done, rarely are we mentioned. Now, Richard has done articles on this area, so they've not been totally ignored, but this charge became a challenge to all of us to see that this history did become an integrated part of the larger history. Most of the chapters are individual areas, but a few of them, such as Eloise's lead chapter, Liz's ending one, and mine in the middle, try to follow from the early 1600s and go all the way through. Eloise told me I had to stop writing when I doubled the number of pages she'd allowed, so I had to stop in 1870, but the history certainly is, a train goes through. And what I'd like to do here is the charge that became a challenge. I discuss and launch the chapter with what I call a distortion of historical memory, a perspective that has been a surprise, I would say, more to my peers here. As I discussed this topic with others, I discovered that a common reaction and surprise of memory of many here that slavery ever existed in the North, much less in Eastchester. And in this distortion of memory, slavery and racism have been relegated to the South, while anti-slavery attitudes, freedom, equality are thought to be the prerogatives of the North. The history of New York slavery reveals that it's much more of a complicated history than this history by stereotype indicates. And as very well-known African-American historian Ira Berlin has said, and I'll give a quote from him, most New Yorkers know very little of this region's deep association with slavery. It was not a small and fleeting presence, a minor institution of, little economic or political consequence, and one that was immediately disposed of when New Yorkers recognized its heinous evil. Slavery was central, not peripheral, to New York history. For nearly 300 years, slavery was an intimate part of the lives of all New Yorkers, black and white, insinuating itself into every nook and cranny of New York's history. For portions of the 17th and 18th centuries, New York housed the largest urban slave population in mainland North America. Slavery died with glacial slowness, and slaves could be found in New York into the 5th decade of the 19th century. Yet as it died, the importance of New York's commerce, politics, and culture increased in tandems with the city's connections and support of the slave South. Now, except for, as I said, a few historians such as Richard and a Mount Vernon historian, Larry Spruill, little has been done on this area, yet, as I discovered, one of the things about how rich the record really is of this in our, if you take individual records that exist. For example, in the Eastchester vaults in Linda's office is a book that's called The Book of Colored People. And this record is everything that happened to slaves as they were emancipated in New York in the turn from the late 18th century to the early 19th century. Slavery is said to have existed here until 1827. Actually, it went on into the 1840s in Eastchester and in New York. And though it was theoretically started in 1799, what they called the gradual emancipation process, what that set up was no slave existing at that point was freed, but only those born after that particular date, July 4th of 1799, so that only a child born would be freed, and each child born, a male, had to work for 28 years as an indentured person in the previous slave owner's home, and a female would work for 25 years. That was changed a little bit so that it became a little bit more of I would say, a compensated abolition. But this record book that Linda has records the birth of all of these children, what happened to them if they were freed, and how we gradually moved into emancipation. Another very important record that she has is of the early school systems. Schools were established here supposedly by the Covenant. They should have been established very early on, but were not until later. Yet part of this gradual emancipation was that education had to be provided for slaves so that when they became free, they would be educated. Now that meant either the master had to do it himself or there were schools. And so Eastchester set up several schools that were integrated school systems, and as far as we can tell, integrated perhaps more peacefully than they were much later in the local area's history. Another important thing about that, the school histories, is that this is when we begin to see surnames attached to slave names. Slaves are usually identified just as very common single first names, and not until they became free did they get surnames usually added to them. So this, I sort of in my chapter equate a little bit with that early covenant where we have the Gyans, the Drakes, the Fowlers, the Fishers, all of these people. Then we begin to have a list of names that will follow through for a number of generations through the 19th century, back into the Revolutionary period, as a matter of fact, of some of the families of African Americans. I think I have probably gone over my 5 minutes, but yes, anyway.
Richard?
I was lucky. I only had to do 3 decades. The title of my chapter is A Community Transformed, Ethnic, Suburban Growth and Ethnic Change. Now let me put that in. I taught in the public schools for 40 years, so I'll simplify the topic. The first 3 decades of the 20th century signify the most significant changes and the largest growth in population over the 350 years of our history. In 1900, Eastchester was a rural enclave with a manufacturing center in Tuckahoe. You had the Tuckahoe marble quarries, you had Hodgman rubber, and a number of other smaller industries. But basically, Eastchester was farmland. And then, in that time, in those 30 years, the population of this town, including the villages of Eastchester, of Tuckahoe and Bronxville, increased 7-fold. And waves of new arrivals came into the community, changing the demographics of this town. And there were 2 very separate waves of, or actually 3. At the turn of the century, many people were moving in to the newly incorporated village of Bronxville, which was incorporated in 1898. The man who pioneered that village was William Van Duzer Lawrence, and his idea was to set up a community that would allow people of substance and character and wealth from New York City to escape the drawbacks of living in a congested urban environment and move into a planned community. The famous, our noted urban historian, Ken Jackson, described Lawrence's community, known as Lawrence Park, as endlessly copied but never duplicated. And a number of people were moving right here into Bronxville, but just up the road was the village of Tuckahoe, which would be incorporated 4 years later. Edna Gabler wrote a great chapter on the American Revolution. And one time I was talking to Eloise, and I said, we were talking about the great changes in Eastchester history, and I made a comment which she corrected me on, and she was right. I said, the revolution really changed Eastchester. And Eloise looked at me and said, no, it just destroyed it, because after the revolution, nothing had changed. But Edna had a great quote about the revolution. She said, the people of Eastchester, because everything was destroyed, feared everything and loved no one. And it would be Tuckahoe, first with the marble quarries, also an attempt to establish a cotton mill, and then Hodgman Rubber. But Tuckahoe was a viable working community. And at the beginning of the 20th century, first as a trickle and then as a tidal wave, Italians began to move into the community. And thousands of Italians moved into Tuckahoe. I think it was like 2,200 according to the census. And Upper Eastchester, which was not called Eastchester, it was called Upper Tuckahoe. 15 years later, during World War I, another significant movement of people came into Tuckahoe. African Americans fleeing the prejudice of the South started to move into Tuckahoe, and within a decade, close to 600 African Americans moved in, and they began to live in our community. I'm going to share two stories with you because, like everyone else, I'm going over my time. One is a story. I have many stories in my chapter, but one of my favorites is the story of Philip DePippo. Now, Al DePippo, who lives in town, was helping me on my research, and I was going through the Tuckahoe record in town hall one day, and I learned about one of his relatives, Philip. Philip was an 11-year-old boy going to the Main Street school, and he was misbehaving. So he was sent to the principal, Miss Hayes, who was cross-eyed. She'd look at you like this way out of the corner of your eye. And little Philip, she took Philip into a room, took out a belt, and started to whip him. Well, she got a little carried away, and there were huge welts on his back. He went to the school nurse. He was sent home, and his parents were furious. And they went to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and they took Miss Hayes to court. The school board actually defended their principal, and she was acquitted. What was interesting, in an editorial, she said, "I had to use extreme methods because the population of my school is very cosmopolitan." Now, what that really meant is there were too many Italians. There was a lot of ethnic and also racial tension in the 20s, not just here in Eastchester and Tuckahoe, but all over the country. That summer, an African-American man was arrested, his jaw was broken, and a week later, an alleged shot was fired on the police station. In retaliation, the Ku Klux Klan came into Tuckahoe and was burning crosses. The police chief named Simpkins hired extra policemen to keep order. Now, what's really unusual is that these tensions not only did not get out of control in Tuckahoe, but in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the village of Tuckahoe was a model of ethnic diversity long before the civil rights movement.
That's a perfect place to start.
Yes, and I can talk forever.
Janet Lentz.
Hi. I'm going to discuss just a few of the highlights of my chapter of the Depression era. At the start of my research, I examined the New York Times archives using the search terms work progress administration and Eastchester. One of the items that came up, dated February 1936, was approval for improvements to Old Brush Farm located on the lands of the Hutchinson River Parkway at California Road, including re-roofing, painting of the riding ring, dwelling, and stables. By looking at old maps, I could see that the former dairy farm referred to was the present-day Twin Lakes Riding Academy, then and now owned by Westchester County. Hoping to find other projects in town, I obtained records from the National Archives, which listed every proposed but not necessarily completed WPA project in Tuckahoe, Bronxville, and Eastchester. The microfilm files of typewritten project cards were sent to me on DVDs so I could look at them on my computer. It was fun to see actual street names and locales around town. On examination, most projects consisted of road and sewer construction, repair of public buildings, and even reconfiguration of Bronxville High School football field. Vin Bielu, I don't know how do you pronounce his name, Bielu, a prominent Eastchester resident who died in 1996 and was Mickey Kennedy's father, reminisced in his newspaper column that the WPA helped many people in Eastchester and that sewer work on Garth Road in the north end of town helped him earn money to complete his college education. Other WPA projects around town included a WPA nursery school in Tuckahoe, a veteran cemetery survey project which inventoried interred war veterans throughout Westchester, including those in Holy Mount in Eastchester and the Bronxville Cemetery, and the Westchester Control Survey that hired unemployed engineers, including 7 Eastchester residents, to place markers for surveyors. Another federal project, the Public Works Administration, aided in the construction of the Greenvale School in 1935, which replaced the old Wilmont School, which had been condemned as a fire trap. The Bronxville Post Office was completed in 1938 as part of a national effort during the Depression to spur economy by building new post offices. You might notice that post offices of this era in different towns across the country are very similar in appearance to the one in Bronxville. The mural on the north wall of the post office, entitled "The Arrival of the First Mail in Bronxville in 1846," and it's beautifully photographed for our book, was painted by John French Sloan, a leading artist of the Ashcan School of American Artists who depicted urban life in the first decades of the 20th century. The Bronxville Post Office was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on November 11, 1988. I discovered another interesting tidbit while researching the New Yorker archives online using the search terms WPA and Bronxville. A General Brehan Burke Somerville was head of the WPA in New York City. He was on loan from the Army, and he was the 8th person to try to run the city's work relief program. He lived at 33 Avon Road, which is Marylynn's present house, and a long laudatory two-part profile in the New Yorker reported that, quote, "Colonel Somerville lives quietly in Bronxville with his wife and 3 daughters, commutes by car, arriving in his office before 9, 6 days a week, and generally leaving after 6. No other WPA administrator in the country exercises so much power." Another effect of the Depression was the ability of homeowners to hang on to their homes. Bob Riggs recalls that his parents bought their home at 339 Pondfield Road, the old Masterton homestead, in 1937 from the Union Dime Savings Bank for $10,000. There was a rumor that over half the residences in Bronxville were owned by banks during the Depression. Local legend has it that an informal group of Bronxville residents offered admittedly below market bids on 50 distinctive homes in order to preserve them and also to offer an alternative to any homeowner who was in such a black mood that he could not go on. However, life did go on in the 30s. The Night of Sport, featuring stars from the world of sports and music and radio, was held each year as a fundraiser from 1932 to 1939. And near the end of the Depression, the 1939 World's Fair must have been a highlight for many town residents. And in the book, you will see an illustration of Amy Dusenberry's World's Fair ticket, as well as many other wonderful, wonderful illustrations.
Thank you. I think Jeff and Claire figured out how to share their time, and
we have no idea how to share our time. Let me just give a little, a brief personal story here that Claire and I went to a meeting a couple of years ago about the book, and we promised each other we would sit on our hands and not volunteer to do anything. By the time the meeting was over, we had volunteered to write a chapter. My wife is a library media specialist, and she did all the research, and I did the writing. We wrote a chapter on sports and recreation in between the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and we just had a fabulous time doing it. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the woman down here. Eloise Morgan shepherded this book from beginning to end in a way that you just cannot imagine. So I really need to acknowledge her before I do. And the only thing more daunting than writing 20 pages when we had 100 to write is trying to do this in the next 3 minutes. We were told, don't write a yearbook. In other words, if you're going to write about sports, and we don't really want to hear about that kid who ran for 4 touchdowns in 1937 and that kid who did this. And we actually found ourselves writing about incredibly world kind of figures that actually came out of Bronxville, Eastchester, and Tuckahoe. We spoke not that long ago at Leawood Country Club for almost an hour with slides and things just about the 4 golf courses and golfers that came out of Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. So for us to speak 3 minutes on the whole chapter is very strange. You have to understand this was a time of tremendous heroes. I mean, many of us don't think like that, but we don't have heroes today that like there were in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. There's no one around today like Babe Ruth. A Derek Jeter is not like a Babe Ruth. You know, we know him here in New York, but this is not like Babe Ruth was, or Charles Lindbergh, or Joe Louis, or Jack Dempsey, or Knute Rockne. These unbelievable figures that captured the imagination of everyone in the entire United States on the radio. There were no TVs to look at in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. There weren't any cell phones or anything for kids to play with other than to go out and play sports. So they emulated everything they heard on the radio and their parents were reading in the newspaper. It was a tremendous time for kids and adults to pick up on what they heard and what was so exciting going on in the United States and around the world, if they could hear about that. Marty Glickman, who many of us grew up with doing sports for the New York Giants on the radio, Marty Glickman was at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin with Jesse Owens. He was on the same team as Jesse Owens, and he said that sports during the Depression was a way to relieve the depression of the Depression. He said that's what sports was. Now, here in Bronxville, Eastchester, and Tuckahoe, we sometimes had 5,000 people out on the Crestwood and Bronxville lakes in the winter doing ice skating and watching ice carnivals and ice competitions. Those lakes haven't frozen since the 70s, whether it be climate change or they need to be dredged or whatever. There was swimming that went on out there. The county came down and built lockers and places for people to change. People all along the Bronx River, from down in the Bronx up to Scarsdale and White Plains, people went swimming all the time in the Bronx River until it became not able to use for swimming. There was bowling in the village hall here in Bronxville. There were alleys. This was, there are things, there's a lot of people out there who don't have books on their laps. So I want to excite you to go buy a book. And I'm telling you, there's some incredible things in this chapter of ours. You will read about some of the amazing athletes in Bronxville, Eastern, and Tuckahoe who never came back from the war. We have a whole section on that. People that went off to war, great athletes. One of them died on the Juno. A guy named Ed Heinziger, he died on the Juno, which is where the 5, fighting Sullivans died, those 5 brothers. Well, we now passed the law saying we won't put 5 brothers on the same boat ever again. Tremendous stories of what, Brokaw called the greatest generation. Those people came right out of here, came right out of our schools, went off to war, came back, and taught in our schools. It is a fabulous chapter about, it's not that long ago. It's not from the 1600s. There are athletes there from the 40s, citizens just like us, who then grew up, gave birth to other kids who are all here in this town right now. And I want to just mention one thing that's really interesting. We had 2 guys came out of Tuckahoe High School and Eastchester High School who actually were across the line from each other. One guy named Al Carapella played for the San Francisco 49ers, and another guy named Wash Serini who played for the Chicago Bears. And I challenge you to find any other time in our history where 2 guys from Eastchester actually were across the line from each other in a professional football game. So very exciting stuff in this chapter, and I invite you to all go outside and buy a book.
Lisa?
So we beat on boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past. The rivers chapter is going to take you on a 350-year journey of our rivers in Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville, and how what happened on them was really what happened to America and what happened to people in general over 350 years in 3 minutes. Okay. It's going to take you through people who thought it was beautiful, people, the beavers who were here, the bathers who were here. You stole a little of my chapter, Jeff. and beauty, but it was sprinkled with the concept of people coming here for resources. And as these parkways and other things were built, that they were also here for recreation, which also ties in with yours. The beauty begins with Jonas Bronk in 1639, namesake, obviously, of the Bronx and other Bronx River. But he came up the East River through the Bronx River, and he wrote a letter saying it was a veritable paradise, that he had the most beautiful region he had ever seen in the world. But he also knew he needed resources, and in those days, colonists came here with millstones on their boats, partly as ballast, but also so when they arrived, that they knew that they were going to have a millstone for their flour and grain, et cetera, et cetera. So Bronx Search combined both beauty and resources. I used those first lines about born ceaselessly into the past because my chapter opens with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, where he talks about the Dutch coming up and seeing this country for the first time ever. And he uses a quote that for a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. So that whole concept of beauty really goes throughout all of this whole Eastchester area. He was in Fitzgerald's book, he has Gatsby gazing across the Sound, basically at this area. And he realized that all the resources here on both rivers, obviously the fertile valley, which was farmland, the water power for the mills, the landings and docks, the dairy farms. The Bronx River had shipbuilding on it at the mouth of the East River. The beaver pelts, there are records that there were 80,000 beaver pelts sold in the New Netherlands area, many of which were on the Bronx River, obviously, because the Indians called it the river of stringing lakes because so many beavers built dams all along it. So it wasn't even just the mills who were changing the water, it was them also. The mills, the marble, obviously, and we'll get to the bathers in a moment. We all have a connotation of the word frozen these days, especially if you have a little girl. But frozen had a different connotation. It had the connotation of ice harvesting. Ice was harvested on Tuckahoe Pond. Ice was harvested in Rattlesnake Brook, which is down near the Co-op City area, and it was harvested at Twin Lakes, where they were talking about here near the Hutchinson River. They believe that Twin Lakes area a lake stretched all the way over to New Rochelle High School, and there was an ice factory there. There was ice harvesting there. There are actually photos of people of a factory and our ice houses. Overcrowding in the city is noted as early in books as 1792, if they only knew what overcrowding might mean. And so areas like Westchester and this area where Lawrence Park and other places that people started to move into, but city folk weren't real clear about why people moved up here. And there's some actual correspondence of a woman who lived in the city, and her friend had moved to Bronxville. And the woman in the city writes her and says, "Oh, where do you bathe the baby?" And her answer was, "Why, in the Bronx, of course." Imagine extolling the virtues of the Bronx River as a place to bathe your baby, not just to bathe. So, as all this was happening, though, what happened is the demons of industrialization came full steam ahead. It was the most obvious on the rivers. The rivers were started to be mentioned in government acts and regulations around 1860. That's the earliest that I could find. The Bronx River was mentioned in some of these acts, the River and Harbors Act, and at other times they tried to dredge the Eastchester, the Hutch, which was at different times in different places, different sections called Eastchester Creek. So they were dredging it, they were deepening it, they were getting rid of pollution. And again, around this time, the word pollution starts to come to the fore. People who lived near the rivers didn't need a proclamation by the government to know that the rivers were polluted. And in In Bronxville and other places all along Tuckahoe, there was malaria. People took quinine with their morning coffee. They write about taking quinine with it. But what it brings up also is that at that time, waterfront property was considered subprime property. Okay, it took us like Hurricane Sandy and Irene to make us realize you might not want to live so close to the water. But around this same time, the zoo and the botanical gardens have been built. And this was part of like Teddy Roosevelt and the whole concept of let's have a progressive society, let's do things for the masses. So they had built the zoo, but unfortunately, the Bronx River led into the zoo. And the zoo smelled as badly as the area up here smelled when you're near at the Bronx River. They had serious infections of the animals. So you have this beautiful zoo that they build, and what happens? They realized there's pollution along the river, and it all ended up right down in this beautiful new Bronx Zoo. And what happens is that begins the journey of four men who tried to take this bull by the horns and figure out what are we going to do. They were more than successful. They devoted all their time and expertise over several years, around 1905, to try and figure out what to do. They literally walked the parkway over and over. Excuse me, it wasn't a parkway, my mistake. They walked the river over and over. What are we going to do? And they came up with a plan to not just clean up the river, but to also build a linear parkway along it. It's actually called the Bronx River Reservation, is the actual term, and the goal was to bring it 100 feet wide on each side so that nobody could build on it. They never wanted to see that kind of pollution along the Bronx River again. Is that a good place to stop?
Well, I think we've demonstrated how this book ended up to be 340 pages. We were going to allow some time for questions, but I know we've killed an hour. And so unless there is a really pressing question, I think maybe we'll just let you go out and buy books. Any questions given that introduction? Thank you very much for coming out tonight.